Have you ever actually stopped to think about how we went from the totally chaotic, unregulated factories of the early Industrial Revolution to the highly structured, hyper-efficient modern businesses we know today? It didn't just happen by magic. It took some seriously brilliant and maybe even a little obsessive minds looking at this massive, disorganized human effort and asking, okay, how can we do this better? Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're taking a super fascinating journey through the evolution of classical management. We're literally going to look at the foundational DNA of how modern work is organized, planned, and executed.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to start in the 1800s with the early management pioneers, then jump to the early 1900s for the scientific management revolution, look at how folks perfected time and motion, and finally, wrap up with Max Weber's concept of the ideal bureaucracy.
Now, this grand family tree of organizational theory shows us exactly where our journey begins today. Take a look at the classical viewpoint, highlighted right there. Before we had complex behavioral sciences or advanced quantitative models or modern systems theories, we just had this classical viewpoint. This right here is the root system. Basically, every modern framework you might use in your office today, whether that's agile project management or automated HR systems, it all ultimately traces its lineage right back to these foundational concepts we're about to unpack.
So, let's kick things off with Section 1, Early Management Pioneers.
Picture the 1800s for a second. The Industrial Revolution is absolutely booming. Almost overnight, work is moving from these small home setups to massive factories, and people are suddenly dealing with unprecedented problems of scale. They needed immediate, on-the-ground solutions. Now, the first responses were, well, pretty uncoordinated. People didn't even view management as a separate, unified science yet. But these three innovators you see here, Robert Owen, Charles Babbage, and Henry R. Towne, they really began planting the vital seeds of management by tackling very specific, isolated factory problems.
Let's contrast two of these early visionary thinkers. Over on the left, we've got Robert Owen. He was a factory owner in the early 1800s. And while other owners were basically working their employees to the bone, Owen had this incredibly radical idea. He argued for better working conditions, reasonable lunch breaks, safety standards, and even investing in the local community's sanitation and education. He was essentially advocating for corporate social responsibility literally a century before it became a corporate buzzword. Now on the right, there's Charles Babbage. If you're into computer science, you definitely know him as the father of computing. But Babbage also applied that brilliant, highly logical mathematical mind to factory operations. He figured out that you could divide up not just physical labor, but mental labor too. So he advocated for extreme work specialization, detailed cost analysis, and even early profit-sharing plans to motivate workers. Honestly, both of these guys were just way ahead of their time.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Scientific Management Revolution.
As we cross over into the early 1900s, all those fragmented, isolated ideas began to finally coalesce into a rigorous, unified approach. And that was largely driven by this guy, Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of scientific management. His ultimate life's mission was finding, as he put it, the one best way for a job to be done. Taylor actually started as a laborer and worked his way all the way up to chief engineer. And along the way, he noticed this massive problem he called soldiering. This was basically workers deliberately working way below their full capacity. To fix this, Taylor figured management couldn't just rely on guesswork or tradition. It needed actual science.
So the really crucial point here is exactly how he applied this science. And there is honestly no better example than his famous shovel and pig iron experiments at Bethlehem Steel. Taylor noticed that workers were actually bringing their own shovels from home to the factory. So a guy might use the exact same shovel to lift super heavy iron ore as he would to lift lightweight ashes. Taylor systematically tested all these different shovel sizes and figured out that a worker was most efficient when the shovel load was exactly 9.5 kilograms. Not 10, not 8, but 9.5. So he designed specific shovels for specific materials, a small one for heavy iron, a large one for light ashes. The result of this? He boosted productivity by a staggering 200%. No joke.
Taylor took that success and formalized it into these four distinct principles. First, scientifically study the task to find the single best method. Second, carefully select and train workers to use that exact method. Third, cooperate fully with the workers to make sure the method is followed. But look really closely at step 4. Divide work and responsibility. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that before Taylor, workers planned how to do their work and then they went and executed it. Taylor permanently shifted the burden of planning to the managers, leaving the execution strictly up to the workers. This was a totally monumental shift in organizational dynamics.
That brings us to Section 3,
perfecting time and motion.
Building directly on Taylor's scientific foundation, his closest associates started to hyper-focus on human movement and psychology. Enter the absolute powerhouse husband and wife team of Frank and Lillian Gilbreth. Frank was borderline obsessed with optimizing physical movement. He studied bricklaying, which is a trade that had been around for literally thousands of years, and he completely re-engineered the motions involved. Just by eliminating wasted movements, he nearly tripled a bricklayer's daily productivity. Crazy, right? On the flip side, Dr. Lillian Gilbreth brought in a highly crucial missing element: human psychology. She was one of the very first people to ever study the psychological implications of management on workers. Astonishingly, though, because of the massive gender biases of the early 1910s, publishers actually forced her to drop her first name and publish her groundbreaking doctoral thesis simply as L.M. Gilbreth, just so readers wouldn't know she was a woman.
Another key figure from this era you definitely need to know is Henry Gantt. If you've ever managed a project in your life, you've almost certainly used his greatest invention, the Gantt chart. He created these visual tracking bars to schedule and monitor project timeframes, and I mean, it's a tool that remains absolutely essential in project management today. Beyond that, Gantt strongly advocated for pay incentive systems to motivate workers, and he firmly believed that businesses had a social responsibility to their communities, really echoing Robert Owen from a century earlier.
All right, final stop. Section 4, Weber's Ideal Bureaucracy.
We're going to zoom out a bit now. While Taylor and the Gilberts were heavily focused on the micro level, how a worker swings a shovel or lays a brick, massive global corporations needed a macro-level structure to just govern themselves. Now today, I know the word bureaucracy instantly makes us think of endless red tape, agonizingly slow government lines, and soul-crushing paperwork. But as defined here, the German sociologist Max Weber actually designed bureaucracy as a utopian system. Seriously. He looked around and saw workplaces totally driven by nepotism, where managers promoted their unqualified buddies or paid people totally differently based on arbitrary whims or personal biases. Weber invented bureaucracy to be this perfectly rational, impersonal system of ultimate fairness.
Weber outlined these very specific characteristics to make his ideal system actually work. Specialization of labor and a clearly defined hierarchy meant everyone knew exactly what their job was and exactly who they reported to. Formal rules and procedures were written down so expectations were crystal clear. And perhaps most importantly, there was an impersonal application of rules. This meant the system was engineered so that an employee's gender, their hometown, or their personal connections to the boss simply wouldn't matter. The rules applied to everyone equally. Period.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real crowning achievement of Weber's model, how it handled career advancement. In an ideal bureaucracy, selection and promotion are strictly tied to member qualification and actual performance. It's not about who you know, it's not about what wealthy family you come from, but what you can actually do. This was a truly revolutionary concept for leveling the playing field in the workplace.
So, let's take a quick look at this incredible timeline of evolution we've just traveled. We started out in the 1800s with early pioneers like Owen and Babbage trying to bring just a little bit of humanity and mathematical logic to those chaotic early factories. Then we moved into 1911 and the scientific management era, where Taylor and the Gilbreths relentlessly pursued the one best way to perform physical tasks. And finally, we saw Max Weber in the early 1900s building that rational, rule-based bureaucratic framework to govern these massive new organizations fairly.
Which brings us to a final, somewhat provocative question for you to chew on. Take a hard look at your own organization today. We have the technology, the software, and the data that these classical pioneers could literally only dream of. But are our modern workplaces truly functioning on the pure merit and scientific efficiency they envisioned? Or, beneath all our modern corporate polish, do we still struggle with the exact same biases, inefficiencies, and arbitrary management whims? Perhaps to move forward, we might just need to rediscover the utopian ideals of the very people who invented management in the first place. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.